The client in this case was not your prototypical construction worker. This was a woman who had come from Ecuador. She was struck in the head with this falling object and rendered unconscious. My name's Scott Occhiogrosso. I'm a partner here at Block, O'Toole & Murphy. The client in this case was not your prototypical construction worker. This was a woman who had come from Ecuador. She was 60 years old and she was working as a union construction laborer doing demolition work on this particular project. This was a huge renovation project of a Manhattan high-rise. At the time of the accident, this client was collecting debris in the ground level of the project to put the debris into dumpsters. There was work going on other floors. She was in an open area, sort of an atrium area of the building, and something that was the subject of demolition at a higher floor was thrown down. It was a piece of metal. It was never fully identified what it was. It was believed that it might be framing for a vent. She was struck in the head with this falling object and rendered unconscious. The client suffered a concussion from the trauma to her head. She suffered injuries to her spine, both her cervical spine, her neck, and her lumbar spine, her lower back. The client was severely impacted by the injuries, and I think largely having to do with the fact that this is a woman of diminutive stature, 60 years old, who frankly had had a rough life. In Ecuador, in her native country, she left school by the age of what here would be second grade and essentially had to work from then on in one capacity or another. She grew up in hardship and poverty that people here don't ever understand and should be really grateful that they don't. So by the time she arrived here and was able to get a job as a union construction laborer at 60, she had put her body through so much already and taxed her system in every way, working just to survive. That's sort of the good and bad of what happened to her, because she was so resilient, and despite the fact that, honestly, when she came into the office, it was painful to watch her walk. It was painful to watch her stand up from a sitting position or sit down from a standing position. She was so obviously in agony, but somehow she always had a smile on her face. There was no question that she was not going to be able to work in any physical capacity and wasn't qualified to work really in any other capacity. And she ended up having a fusion surgery on her cervical spine and on her lumbar spine as well. She did suffer some of the sequelae of post-concussion syndrome. That's an aspect of the case that the leader of our team, Dan O'Toole, is always sensitive to, and he always insists that we pay close attention whenever a client has suffered a concussion, that there are ways that that can impact somebody that sometimes are missed by treating physicians, mostly because they focus on orthopedic injuries, and even missed by the client to an extent, because frankly, people aren't as aware as you would think of little or slight cognitive changes. It could be something as simple as being more forgetful than they used to be, or becoming more emotional without really understanding why, more irritable, having a tendency to have crying fits and not knowing why. Some obvious signs like headaches, or what's called photophobia, which is a heightened sensitivity to light, or phonophobia, heightened sensitivity to sound. This client suffered from a number of these symptoms, and they're sort of intermittent or on and off, and sleep disturbances, really a number of very challenging things. This was an instance where a worker on a construction site was struck by a falling object, an object that should have been secured to the extent that there wasn't the risk of injury or a gravity-related risk from the object falling and striking a worker. And this was an instance in this sort of project where demolition is ongoing. The job site needs to be safe for workers doing what this particular worker was doing, which is collecting debris at the ground floor level. The labor law that protects workers in this instance is Labor Law 240, which protects workers on construction sites against gravity-related risks, whether the worker falls from a height because they don't have an adequate elevation device, ladder or scaffold, scissor lift or something else, or because the worker is struck by an object or a load that isn't properly secured and ends up falling due to the forces of gravity. In this case, the specific facts involved in the accident happening were they had a dedicated drop zone where materials were being thrown down into. Once the materials were thrown down into the atrium area on the ground floor, then workers such as our client were supposed to then gather the materials and put them into construction containers or dumpsters. Obviously, there needs to be clear communication, and those things need to be happening in completely separate stages of the work. At one point in time, materials are being thrown down from higher floors into this atrium area. Clearly, nobody can be down underneath collecting the materials. Once they start collecting the materials, nobody can be throwing the materials down. That was the precise communication failure that led to this accident. Workers were still throwing materials down. There was no physical barricade preventing our client or other workers from starting to collect debris, and there was no verbal instruction that was given. We moved for summary judgment on liability under the theory that both the owner and the general contractor had violated Labor Law 240, and we were successful in that motion. The defense did push back. It was more of a factual fight than it was on the law. There really was no dispute that this was an object that should have been secured, or that it was subjected to the forces of gravity, or that it resulted in injury to our client. The factual argument was there were witnesses who came in who said that the area was cordoned off and that instructions were given to the workers that they were supposed to wait and they weren't supposed to be in this drop zone area at the time. Ultimately, the court found that that was a self-serving testimony that wasn't worthy of credibility. One, there was no proof, no documentary or photographic evidence. There were no reports of a safety plan that explained how this area was cordoned off. There were no photographs showing the area barricaded off. And there were other workers who said that they too were very close by, in close proximity, collecting debris when this happened. This case was handled all the way through to where it was on the trial calendar, and there was a date to commence jury selection. At that time, the parties agreed to do a mediation where we, on behalf of the plaintiff, and the defense attorneys on behalf of the insurance carriers and the insurance adjusters from those insurance carriers, attend a mediation with what is either a retired judge or another very qualified attorney who is an objective, neutral, attempts to broker an agreement between the sides as to a fair resolution of the case. Fortunately, we were able to arrive at a fair and just outcome. The case ultimately resolved for $5 million. You never had somebody that you rooted for more. Just the fact that she spoke no English, second grade education from Ecuador, less than 5 feet tall, probably weighed about 100 pounds, 60 years old, and was working, doing demolition work on a construction site happily. And even after all she suffered, even as she was wincing and barely able to walk in the office, she always had a smile on her face. So we rooted for her so much. We wanted so much to see a fair outcome. This is somebody who really never, because she was such a humble person, she never expected an outcome like this. She didn't allow herself to think about an outcome like this in the case. And when we told her what happened, she broke down in tears, and she thanked us and she thanked God for the outcome of the case. And she and her husband have since left the New York area. They've moved somewhere warm. They have a beautiful home, and they're able to take care of their family and extended family in ways that they never otherwise would have been.